All right, moving on to part 3 of making a print in the darkroom. I've turned the fluorescent lights on because I've got a couple of things that we need to be able to see when it comes to the enlarger and adjustments that you can make on there, and a couple of other props which I have setting out over here. Before I go to make a print, and before I make a test strip of that print, I need to adjust my contrast. Contrast is difficult to explain without ample visual aids, but as you work in the darkroom and you try multiple versions of the same print, you will actually start to see how contrast affects your prints. When I talk about contrast, what I mean is how to change the settings in a print that will adjust how bright the bright areas are and how dark the dark areas are in your print. If you think about it, low contrast creates a print that has gray, lots of gray, dark highlight areas and light shadow areas. A print that has high contrast has light highlight areas and dark shadow areas with little gray in between. So we want to be able to sort of balance out our contrast, which is a philosophy that will apply to many settings in our printmaking. First is that I'm going to make sure my enlarger is set in the middle. I've got a relatively neutral darkness negative in my negative carrier, meaning it's not too light and not too dark. And if I use a setting in my lens that is in the middle, that means after my first test strip, if I need more light, I can switch to a setting that gives me more light, 5.6 instead of 8. If I need less light, I can go darker to 11 instead of 8, okay? Contrast, similarly, is also defined on a scale. In the old days, photographers would use filters like this that actually change the contrast in your print. Low contrast was defined by more yellow, and high contrast is defined by more magenta. And the way that we adjust contrast on our color enlargers is by using the yellow dial and the magenta dial. And instead of having to figure out your values on your own, every enlarger has a chart next to it that defines the old style of contrast filters, numbered 0 through 5, and a corresponding yellow setting and a magenta setting to set your enlarger to duplicate these contrast settings. And in the old days, contrast was defined in half-step increments from 0 to 5, where yellower settings were lower and higher magenta settings were higher. And for our purposes, what we're going to do is we're going to start at 2.5, which is right in the middle. And you can see that on this scale, at 2.5, the yellow setting should be 32 and the magenta setting should be 42. And to adjust that on my enlarger, I come up here to my yellow dial, and I'm going to turn that to 32, and then I'm going to adjust my magenta to 42. And it's going to change how my print looks as it's shining through my lens, but because the light will be on, I know it will be making a print, and I'm going to use these settings, F8 and a 2.5 contrast, based on this chart, as my starting point to make my test strip, which is what I'll show you next.